and welcome to the Special Needs Sibling Podcast, where we talk about what life is really like as a sibling to someone with special needs. I'm your host, Charlene, and today our guest is Kelsey. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Charlene. I am so excited to be here.
So let's hop into it. Can you please lay out your family structure, like birth order, the age difference between you and your sib, and what your sib's disability is?
So I am the oldest of three daughters. I'm currently, my age is 29. My middle sister, Avery, who was the sibling who had a disability when we were younger, she is 27. And then the youngest sister, Maggie, gosh, she just turned 24, I want to say. So just to give you like an understanding of the family structure, I've got kind of a unique story, I guess I would say, in terms of what it was like for me being a sibling. So my sister, the middle sister, Avery, I was 12 and she was 10. We had like a pretty typical upbringing up until that point. And one night, it was October 15th or 16th, in the middle of October, we had watched a scary movie, I think Halloween themed, and we were just kind of spooked out. So we slept, as we did sometimes, on the floor of our parents' bedroom. And I just remember it was somewhere in the middle of the night, maybe 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I remember feeling Avery like kicking me, like it felt like she was kicking me. And, I was 12, we were siblings, so we just would punch each other all the time. But I was like, oh, that's weird, we're asleep. So I was whispering to her, Avery, stop kicking me, stop kicking me. And I realized at that moment, like something was wrong, but I went kind of into like a freeze mode. I didn't know what was up. So I just remember pretending to be asleep and like waiting for it to pass. But I just knew something's not right. And my mom woke up at that point and she looked down at Avery, and I just remember her saying, oh my God, she's having a seizure.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So completely just out of the blue, my dad jumps up off the bed. I can still see him doing it, leaps over the three of us and calls 911, and that phone call, like waiting for her. And we went to the hospital that day and they released us. They thought, maybe it's just one of those one-off things. Kids can sometimes just have seizures randomly, apparently. And so they sent us home. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Right. It was very concerning, but they sent us home. And then in the car ride on the way, I think we were going to pick up a prescription or something. I can't remember the exact details, but she had another seizure in the car as we were like going back home. And so I can remember my parents like just reversing, going as fast as they can back to the hospital.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And that day was kind of like, it marks both an end and a beginning of what my childhood was shaped like and what my sister Avery's was too. So they could, for a long time, we didn't really know what was wrong, but she was having seizure after seizure after seizure. And her seizures were incredibly unique too. It started off as grand mal seizures, which is what you typically think of, where you're shaking and you can't really talk. And then they transformed into, I think they were called tonic-clonic seizures, where she could still verbalize, she could still talk with us, but the room for her went in reverse. So she saw everything backwards and it was spooky. She would become really rigid, but she could talk through it. And so the doctors, we couldn't figure out what was going on. And then finally she was diagnosed with a brain tumor.
Okay.
And I remember like with that diagnosis, it's almost like all of us just kind of collapsed. We thought she was going to die. Spoiler to the end of the story, of course, she's still alive and still with us, so she did not die.
Right.
But it was an incredibly difficult time. And then a couple of years later, we didn't think, there was no surgeon willing to operate on her for a while because where the tumor was housed, it was kind of like in the center of her brain, and there was a huge risk of her being blinded. And this is a funny story. One of the surgeons that we were scheduled to have an appointment with before we finally found the surgeon that did operate on her, Dr. Boop, out in Memphis. But Ben Carson was almost my sister's neurosurgeon. So that's kind of like our funny claim to fame. Not really, but anyhow, so she ended up having the surgery and had not had a seizure since then. So I've got this very bizarre story where it's years of really intense high needs, medical needs sister. And then one day, so it would seem it was over, but it didn't. And there was, of course, like the aftermath of her mental health, our mental health, my family's dynamics and structure, and where it kind of went from there. But that's kind of the overview of the story. And I notice even now as I'm talking about the story, the focus is really on my sister's experience with it. And of course, that shaped me. But here, even in this podcast, I'm having a hard time even verbalizing what it was like for me because it was so focused on her, which is funny, ironic.
Yeah, how many years was that in between, like, um, when she first started having seizures to the, like, operation?
I think it was 2 years. It was not a long time in comparison to having a sibling, like, with developmental needs, which is bizarre because I remember, like, in the moment, it felt like such a long period of time. You're 12, 13, 14. 2 years are everything. And then now looking back on it, 2 years, it goes by in the blink of an eye, but it really changed everything about the dynamics of my family. So, um, of course, my parents, doing the best that they could, sunk everything into her medical care. Um, and I can remember like going out to the living room at night when I couldn't sleep and seeing my mom. She'd have this notebook, I could still see it in my head, where she was researching this type of epilepsy treatment options because there was so much mystery. My sister's case was so unique. Um, and so really so much was focused on trying to save my sister's life. Um, and at the time, I could understand that. But again, as a kid, it's so hard to see. All I felt was my parents really having to pull away from me, which again, now I get. But at the time, I was so um, it was horrible. It was horrible. I didn't have parents for those 2 years, and then even after then, the way that the waves interrupted our family life, was incredibly impactful, and you've experienced that too, where so much of the attention and focus goes towards the sibling, um, and I remember just feeling this really difficult dynamic between being so upset. I was terrified, traumatized from witnessing my sister like nearly die almost every single day. Um, and then also like this pressure and urge to be easy for my parents because I knew they had so much going on with her. So I had so much anger but and fear, but then also I learned to swallow it, to perform a good daughter role for the family. Um, and it just turned into this really uneasy feeling of not knowing who I am if my experiences were um, something to be shameful of. I was so ashamed that I was so upset with my parents for that period of time. And it took me really until graduate school to learn that the experience that I had was like completely normal for me to feel what I did. And that was a pivotal moment too, when I finally understood that the anger, the shame, the fear, the trauma, it all had a name. Like there are other people who'd experienced that. And that was like, whew, that's when I almost like I gave myself permission to say, oh, I was not a bad 12-year-old child for being traumatized by this experience.
And what I think is interesting is, like, for the most part, up until the first seizure, like, you had a fairly, like, normal, neurotypical experience as a child with your parents, and I was like, "Oh, like, that's really interesting," because I feel like there's definitely people, like, in my position, right, where my like, because just because my sister's it's much more developmentally related, right? So it's kinda like I generically saying, right, like, me and some other people have kind of like our parents were always never there type the idea that, right, like, oh, like, they're always gonna be 10 feet away from me, like, "Well, it's always been like that, still gonna be like that, like, maybe it will improve or whatever," like, plus or minus 3 feet here and there, but, like, it's interesting because you didn't have that at all, and then you, like, jumped right into, like, the heart of it instead of it, like and you didn't even get time to acclimate because it just happened, it wasn't like "Oh, I got, like, 3 years of my life normally, and then my sister came, and then, like, oh, then it kinda changed," it's just you just, like, went into the deep end and, like, not by choice, obviously, but it's but I just think that's fascinating because it's like because in, like, the adulthood part of this process, right, like, the things that you feel and experience are, like, more similar to, like, what we experience, even though we're experiencing for, like, longer periods of time, but it was so condensed for you, it's almost I don't know if it's equivalent or not, but I just think it's fascinating that, like, you can go through it for 2 years, and I can go through it to the better part of, like, almost 30 years, but
Yeah,
it's like but we're
the
still talking
impact.
about the same thing, which I think is insane,
Yes, I
right?
agree with you,
Like
Charlene. Like, it gives so much context, I think, for how impactful going through something like that is, where you could experience it your whole life, you could experience it for 2 years, and it also gives me, like, so much compassion and respect for the siblings who go through it for their whole life, because you're right, it was a start and an end for me, even though the end and I'll get into that too, it didn't the end was so fuzzy, but the start, it was literally overnight. Versus like maybe being born into this or being alive for a couple of years before your sibling is born and they're born with a disability or developmental difference. And having kind of like that slow burn wave. And yet, either way, here we both are
I
on the same
know.
podcast. It's funny. I really, like I said, I didn't know that there was even a name for our experience. Like, there's a couple glass children, well siblings, siblings are some of them. I didn't know. I really was so
Oh, I didn't
blinded.
hear those terms till in the last I think when I started this podcast is when I found out about glass children because someone there's a sib I was talking to, and then, like, he had mentioned it, and then I was like, "Oh, what's that?" And, like but I had never heard the other versions of what you're talking about, like, I didn't know they're not new terms, it's just I guess they weren't as popularized or something, I don't know because 'cause they've been around, like, when you read stuff, it's, like, been around for a decent amount of time.
They have. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
It's
not in mainstream conversation.
Oh,
And
yeah,
that's
there we
when
go. Yeah.
when I finally, like, learned what it was, I like I said, I was in, I'm a psychotherapist, so I was in grad school for my therapy program, and I was in an internship, actually, funnily enough, and I knew I wanted to work with, women who struggled, like, with perfectionism, anxiety, and trauma, and I didn't really of course, oftentimes, therapists, we like to work most with what's a reflection of what our struggles have been, um, and so I knew that that was kind of the population I wanted to see, and in my internship, as I was seeing those clients, there were 2 or 3 who just in conversation shared that they had experiences with their siblings being, like, chronically ill, developmentally disabled, etcetera, and I was like, "Wow, that's kind of a crazy coincidence." And then I had a class, our group therapy class, we had to design, a 16-week group therapy, type project, and I was like, "You know what? Let me look into this a little bit further. I think it'd be interesting to potentially design group therapy for siblings like myself, like some of my clients." And that's when the door really opened, when I saw all the research, all the different names, well siblings, siblings, glass children. I read the book Being the Other One, I believe it's called. I can't remember the author.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Kate, she was on
changed
the
my life.
podcast.
She was, that's right. Yes.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness. That book was life changing to me. And so all of this really opened up. And in having I think there's something so powerful about there being, like, names for our experiences, because although, it's not that we're being fit into a box, it's more just so like, hey, this is something that happens so frequently when you grow up the way that we grew up, that there's names for it. There's names for it. There's nothing shameful. Um, and that was just breathtaking. And in fact, there's a line in the book, that I knew I wanted to cover, that really has stuck with me for so long, where she's can't remember exactly the scenario, but she's maybe in a school, there's a sibling who's whose other sibling, right, is going through something, and she says something to the effect of, like, "Make sure you look after that one too." And I read that and just cried because that's exactly, like, what I wish had happened with me. You know, my sister was dying, and I was terrified and traumatized, and I never talked about it. Not with my parents, not with anyone. I actually, the day that she had brain surgery, we couldn't all fly out to I live in North Carolina, we couldn't afford to all fly out to Memphis, so it was my sister, my mom, and my dad were in Tennessee, and I just went to school, and we didn't know if she was gonna survive this surgery. I was just at school, like, in just complete survival mode, um, and looking back on it now, I'm like, I can't imagine being, you know, 13, 14. Well, I can't imagine, I was, but being a kid and
Yeah.
being at school pretending everything was normal while my sister was, while her brain was out in a
Oh,
table. It's
the
just wild.
oh no, like in my current therapy sessions, like there's sometimes I'll like we'll talk about a variety of topics, right? And there's just days where I'm like I sit there and I'm like I don't know how I am a regular functioning adult right now. Like, let alone alive. Like, alive. Like, there's definitely a point where I'm like, the fact that I am living is a thing, right? But that we're so, but moving past that, like, I'm just like the fact that I'm doing even I don't know 20% of the things that I'm doing today is like it doesn't. Yeah, when I think about and look back on like growing up in a variety of topics, it's just like wow, like I don't know how I got here. And right now I know it's because it's a ton of therapy and a ton of work that I've put in and like space and like obviously there's all these things I've done, but like aside from that I've been doing much more intensely within the last like 5-ish years, right? Like it's kind of like I don't know how I got through any of that. Like even when I like yeah, cuz even when we talk about specific topics or I talk and I think about like my current inner circle of people, right, which has changed because I've moved from where like we grew up and stuff. So me and my sister were like somewhere in the like 500 to 600 miles apart, right? And so it's this thing where it's like I would have never imagined being that far away from her, but it's like even then there's just stuff I'm like I don't yeah I don't know how I did it or how I'm here or like how I've like I don't know how I've done half of it, but what's interesting, it's like it's interesting the people that you're still friends with from like a long time ago. Cause I feel like, and I don't know if this is a sibling thing versus just a me thing, is like because I have found it very hard to connect to people at like in that, you know, middle school, high school age, which I hated middle school and high school. I would never go back. I hate the and TV shows when people are like, "Oh, go back." I'm like, "No, like you could never pay me enough money. Like no amount of money in the world would get me to go back in time to that period." But like I think about the people that I already like had a hard time connecting with you for a variety of reasons, but like I think about the friends that I met in high school that I'm still friends with now versus just like, you know, everyone else in my life that I've and I'm like, even that's very like I'm friends with those people because they know very specific things about me that, like, are hard to explain to most general audiences, whether they're sibling related or not. Even if there's because there's some friends that it's not really about me being a sibling, but because we've been friends for so long and they know all these other things, it's like it's equivalent. But it's like I can't yeah, it's just it's so interesting when I look at that versus who I was, and then obviously people change as they go into adulthood, and then even more so after you start doing in therapy and stuff, right? And it's like it's the whole world is just so different, and it's like I
It
don't.
is. How did we get through it? Like, how did we survive? I have that exact same thought, Charlene. It's wild, really. And I struggled with the same thing. And again, I'm with you. Could not pay me any amount of money to go back to middle or high school. Even like if I didn't have my sister's
Yeah,
songs with
like
it,
it's just even yeah,
but
I.
that on top of it. But I struggled so much and still did up until I went to therapy before I entered grad school, to become a counselor, thankfully, which I think everyone should do. But
Yes, I
anyhow,
agree with that. I'm a
I
big therapy advocate for anyone
yes,
experiencing anything. Just you should, if you're thinking about it, consider it. Like, just go try it, and yeah.
yes. Give it a go, absolutely. I say that and not even as just a psychotherapist where it's something that I'm like, "Yes, you should." It truly was life-changing for me. So much of the struggles that I had, it was so hard for me to be emotionally vulnerable with people because I really think very much so links to the experiences of having to swallow my own emotions and perform like the good child. Like you learn how to read people's minds or what you suspect people are thinking, how to meet the needs of the people who are around you, and all while like completely swallowing your own needs. I had a conversation with my sister a couple years ago, and I brought it up in therapy. This was before I went to grad school, and she was like, "That that's trauma, Kelsey." But my sister brought up, she was like, "Hey, do you remember that time like I was having a seizure and you covered your ears and closed your eyes and went and hid in the corner?" And we were kind of laughing about it, like, "Oh yeah, I remember that. That's so funny." Like, yeah, ha 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 ha. Like I was hiding and you were having a seat, and I hid beneath like the kitchen table. That's usually what I did because it was so scary. And I brought that up to my therapist Teresa, and almost as just like a side story. And that was one of those moments where she was like, "Well, hold on, like you're laughing. That's not funny. Like what is funny about that? You're describing like being a child and having a reaction to trauma. Did anyone ever talk to you about that or explain to you what was going on?" And I had this struggle where when I would remember these events, I would forget. I knew intellectually that I was a child, but I would forget that I actually I really was a kid. I would almost implant the version of me now into
Yeah,
those
that
memories
wasn't
and picture.
okay.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
picturing like a 29-year-old covering her ears and closing her eyes. I'm thinking, "Gosh, that's so shameful. Like that's so how cowardly of me." And it took so much for me to be able to actually like emotionally connect with the intellectual knowledge of what I was experiencing. Um, because it was so I couldn't do it at the time. I couldn't um be as afraid as I really was because that's so unsafe. I couldn't be as angry as I was. I couldn't be as that feeling of neglect. And then on top of that, my parents, I have very good parents. They also drank a lot during this time too, I think, as a way for them to cope. And then just also like in general, my dad now thankfully has been sober for 7 years, so he's been in recovery. So yeah, yeah, again in adulthood, but as a kid, my both my parents drank a whole heck of a lot. So there was already that emotional distance between us that comes as a result of that type of heavy drinking. Um, so another piece of work in therapy for me was holding two truths at the same time, like the truth of my parents did the best that they could with what they had because I used to hold on to that so much, like wanting to be like, well, they were going through a hard time. That's true. And at the same time, I didn't get my needs met. Um, and that's another just like being able to hold both those things is complicated.
The whole thing is so complicated. But yeah, it's just it's I remember I had similar experience in terms of like when I in therapy would like passively say something and my therapist is like, "Well, hold on a second, like let's revisit that." Which like cuz there's a yeah, that I've done that a number of times for a number of things. And I think that part is only different because I just had more of it versus like you had a very condensed version. So yeah, and it's also my sister didn't she doesn't have seizures. All her stuff was much
Hmm.
smaller every day, like through my index, like through my flashcards into the toilet, stuff like that, right? Which is like, even if even if she were normal, that could have still happened. Like it's stuff like that where it's like much smaller and much more like over the course of years of stuff happening, then you realize like, oh, okay, that's like an issue. But yeah, the idea that's like, oh, like I'm allowed to feel those things. and I don't have to feel bad for other people. And I was like, "Oh, that's a con." And I think that it was so strange because I was so used to so many years of like feeling everyone else's feelings and feeling responsible for other people's feelings, right? So if we were like in a public space and my sister threw a tantrum, I knew that that wasn't any like I would be scared like, oh, like people are looking at us. Oh man, I wish it wasn't happening. Right. So there's obviously all of those things. But what's interesting is like if I wasn't with her, I could still feel like she was throwing a tantrum, but I felt it was my fault instead, right? But like when she's not there, what sucks about that is like because like it's not like our parents didn't have the tools that we currently have now, right? That's just mental health as a general conversation was not what it is today, right? So the hard part is like it's not like they could help me with that, but I internalized it because I'm not going to tell them I feel like whatever. And so it's this thing where like, yeah, I would be in situations where something bad would happen that's completely unrelated from my existence, right? Like if something like exploded or like someone broke something or someone got into a fight and I happen to be in the same room, that's not my problem, right? That's just timing. Like it happens. You go to a train station, something bad happens, like you just walk into the train station. But the thing was like that at the time, I just assumed it was my fault, right? Or and not that I caused it, but it's just that like, oh shoot, like I should take care of them, or like, oh man, like I wish I hadn't walked into this train station at exactly this time and stuff like that. And I would make it about me, but in a way that's not narcissistic, but just in a like in the oh, I'm responsible for this bad thing happening because on a daily basis I'm dealing with my sister who's having a meltdown, and that's not my fault, but I feel responsible because if the longer people keep staring at us, I have to make it go away, right? And
Yes.
so it's this thing where it took me so long in therapy to come to terms with like, no, like there are just really bad people, and there are really bad coincidences, and there are bad like it just happens. Like it doesn't, it literally has no correlation to my existence, right? And that's been something that like there's some other things I'm still working through and how they those things, like, connect because obviously people have different, like, perspectives of life and how things connect like that, but yeah, it took me so long to, like, ta take that like, obligation, responsibility, shame, guilt part of that equation and recognize, like, "No, like, I'm reacting that way because for, like, the better part of over half my life, I've felt was that," right? And it's I was like I forgot who I was talking to recently, and I was like, "You know, like, my when I moved where I live now, like, my body felt different." Like, I could actually feel the release of, like and it's crazy because, like, for the longest time, like, when I was dating my husband, he's like, "Oh, you need to, like, relax more," and I'm like so he would like, cause you know when you give, like, each other when you give massages, right, like, you can feel how tight people are, even if just on a regular like, that's just a normal experience, right? He's like, "Oh, you should just relax." Now he's like, "Oh, you should relax." I'm like, "Oh, I am." Right? Like, I don't what is that? Like,
It
that's
says
not
me
something
relax.
yeah. Yeah, and so it was funny because we fast forward a ton of years, right? And we get to now and I'm like, "Oh, like, I realized, like" I mean, obviously through therapy and some other things, I realized I'm like, "Oh, no, like, I was really internalizing all of that stress because I actually can feel that, like, my body is actually more relaxed now than when I was living closer. Yeah, like, it's an amazing the body is, like, such a it's like, it's so crazy, like, how that works.
It is, and it's so true. It's like you I think that speaks to, like, the insidious nature of, like, complex PTSD, right? Like, you had these lifelong for years and years and years, microscopic, but not at all. These are also huge events, like having your flashcards flushed down the toilet. That's you say it's small, but it's also it's the accumulation of those events and then also having your experience of that, your feelings invalidated, right? Well, that's just how your sister is. You know what she's going da 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 da. And you it's almost like you get a fragmented sense of self where there's this over responsibility part where it all points back to me. And in a way, we do that as a way to keep ourselves safe, right? Like if I can be responsible for things, if I can control things, then maybe I can help me from not being embarrassed in public, help, whatever. But it almost takes over like the driver's seat where you're holding on to so much for years, and then yeah, your body is like crumpled up with the stress of it all, with lifelong being in this sort of like hyper vigilant state. Um, and I see that a lot, not just with myself, but with my clients too. So I work with siblings now. It's one of my specialties, and it's so fascinating to see. I think that's one of the things I quite enjoy about the work is seeing everyone's unique experience between being a sibling, but then also overarching themes that get woven in there. So I have some clients who are very unlike me who say, I was never angry. I never felt like invalidated. But now that I'm an adult, I'm out of that household, my body, I can't sit still. I can't relax. I can't
Oh, interesting.
let myself be free. And then I have some clients who were like, I was furious. I turned to drugs. Whatever it was. And there's still just these common themes that show up. Um, I don't want to say universally because everyone's so different, but case after case.
Yeah. Because even on the podcast, that's what I've been finding it's like fascinating. And not so much that not I think the thing that's been fascinating is like the level of commonality despite cultural differences, location, age, and a variety of stuff like that. Like and I think that was the thing that I've been more intrigued by. It's like I will talk to people who don't live in the US, right? Or grew up in the US but like very different situations, and it's like, wow, like it, they're all very like overlapping. Like there's Venn diagrams everywhere. Like obviously like we can't you can kind of categorize certain things, but you can't in other ways. And that's been so fascinating is just to see across the board, like at the end of the day, like there's a very large percentage of people, right, where we do the things we do, whether internally or externally in like, the turning to drugs versus like being a good child, right? Like, because those come from the same place of saying you don't care about us and we matter, but you're not showing that, right? They all come from the same root problem, which is like we need to matter, and like you need to tell us that. It can't just be, oh, like here be my children and go away. Like it's really about however we needed to receive the attention and love was the thing we needed, right? So for some people that's like talking, some people that's playing, some people that's like we're gonna go do this, right? Like everyone has their own specific way they need to receive that as a child. But the thing is like it's so hard because like as much as our parents are trying, we can't, right? There are parents who aren't trying. So there's that, but there's people who also they are trying, but it's so hard cuz it's like they can't make up for past time, right? I also am not going to spend my energy being mad at you forever, but we have to acknowledge like I for everyone that I've talked to, I think I've maybe had one person who's said like that, like with her mom, like it's actually like that wasn't healthy. Like her mom is more of a toxic thing, and that's it was safer for her at the end of the day to like walk away. But other than her, like I would really say everyone else at some point has said my parents did good, right? Like, but it's so hard because it's like what sucks about that, I feel, and this is just biased, right? Is like it's almost like we have to say that out of like there's part of us that genuinely believes it, and there's part of us that's like, no, we have to like be nice and like we can't make it about us still because it's like you can't negate. But that's so hard because like obviously like in private spaces, like that's when like the venting can come out. But it's so hard because it's like, and this is just a personal thing. It's like when I see, and this is more like of a media problem. I think is like there's this whole thing about like, oh, parents need these resources and they're trying and like all these things. And I'm like, that's dandy, and it's not wrong, but, like, we're missing a very big part of the population, which is us, right? Like, because really, like, you can help all the parents all they want, and they can do the best they can given the tools and money and whatever, but the problem is, like, in 20 years, the people that are gonna have these problems are their neurotypical children, not them, right? We're like, and that's a whole missing, like, like, we're all in therapy now, right? A majority of people who've been on this podcast have seen therapists, or if not, are therapists themselves, right? They're like, yeah, like, there's very few people who haven't, like, cause but a lot of people will talk about, like, they've at least gone to talk to someone, right? Whether they're, like, currently seeing, like, on a weekly basis, but, like, cause it's a problem. Like, it's a problem that, like, I don't, and all we can do is talk about it here and just hope that people listen to it, but, like, it's a real problem for siblings in, like, in the world. It's not just in the US, this is, like, a global issue.
It's everywhere. Everywhere that anyone has, uh, a sibling with a disability or with a medical it's so widespread, and you're so right, like, so much of the resource and the focus is on parents. "Hey, you're doing your best, here are resources for you." Again, great, we want that. Or on the child themselves that's having the difficulties. Again, that's great, we want that, but we are not in the equation, and that's part of what I love so much about this podcast is it's giving our voice versus other people speaking for us. And that's one of the things I learned in the research that I did about it. A lot of the reports on our mental welfare, our physical welfare from parents were from parents self-reporting. And what they found is that parents tended to say that we were doing far better than what we would report, which of
That's,
course,
yeah,
right?
that
No
makes sense,
surprise
that
to
checks
anyone.
out, like,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But it goes to show that the I think it's so we're missing so many pieces by having the parents be the gatekeepers of checking in on us. Like it should be a part of the conversation when you're involved with medical care for a child, making sure there's resources for the sibling in that conversation too. We do it for families with other types of situations, right? Wives of people with cancer, like family support, and that it's not the same thing with this type of situation. And the research is all pointing like we need it. We need to be in the conversation, and there also has to be a relief of the shame. Because when we're talking about like common threads, we see one I see all the time with siblings is that feeling of shame, whether it's I was a bad kid for needing attention, which is wrong, right? But it's what you feel. It's not true, but it's what you feel. It's what's there. Yeah, again, that disconnect between the intellectual knowledge of knowing kids need attention and support from their parents and the feeling that we grasp onto. Um, and so working through that, I think is so important because my parents, I don't talk about this with them because there was so much, oh, you just want attention. Like you should have been the one that had the seizure. You would have loved being in the hospital, having everyone look at you. And I remember thinking I think I was 16 when I heard that. I remember thinking, that's not what I'm saying. I get it. I get that Avery had a horrible thing happen to her. I'm not saying that I wish that was me. I'm saying that I needed my identity and my experiences seen and held by my parents just as much as she did. And there's nothing wrong with that. But even saying it now, I get nervous. Like, oh, what if my parents listen to this podcast and think I'm selfish? Right? That voice still whispers, and it's something I have to constantly um, check in with myself for. Right? Like kids developmentally desperately need their experiences, their emotions, they need attention from their parents. And if they don't get that, um, their identities don't form fully the way that they should. We turn into mirrors of what we think our parents want from us or from what the world wants from us. And that takes so much work.
Yeah, or the complete
Yeah.
opposite trajectory, which is, again, coming from the same place of, like, well, if you don't care about me, then I'm gonna do, yeah, it's the, I'm gonna do everything you exactly want it to be, or the, I'm gonna go the polar opposite because that's the only way you're gonna pay attention, right? So, but they come from the same, like, yeah, just the desire just to be loved for not having to be a good or bad child, right? And that's the whole thing is that and that's I think that's so hard as a sibling. I think that's specific versus just like, oh, you're in a family of like yourself like three and like before the seizures, right? You just kind of go about your daily lives and you all have your own hobbies and you all get along with your parents. You kind of just you move on. But I feel like in the sibling, like as a sibling, it's just like there is growing up, there was very, very few instances where I felt like I did this for me and I got acknowledged for just that. Like, so much of it was I felt like, oh, you did good in school. Right, but I didn't do good in school because I wanted to, right? Or like, oh, you did a good job taking care of your sister. Well, I didn't do that because I wanted to, right? Like, a lot of my like, we'll call it like verbal accolades, right, is due to like stuff I was doing, but it's because I knew I would get the accolades if I did those things, right? It's not versus if I was just like I remember I taught myself how to do cartwheels at home because for whatever reason I just wanted to learn them, which is funny because I'm right-handed, but I do left-handed cartwheels. But that's because I didn't know. I was just like, oh, you just put the rubber band and you just go over the thing. Like it was like whatever. But like, so everyone was like, are you left-handed? And I was like, no, why? They're like, because you're doing left-handed cartwheels. I went, I am? Okay. Yeah, it was funny once the one person pointed that out. But anyway, right? But stuff like that where, if I had grown up like in a neurotypical household, like where everyone was neurotypical, right? That would be like, oh, like that looks so much fun, right? You acknowledge it or you turn it into something or you ask them, do you want to go do gymnastics? Right? You kind of it's a point of a conversation, but like when I was doing it, it was just like, oh, I'm bored. Like I'm doing this because right. And my parents didn't care, right? And it's not to say it is or isn't a big deal, but it's small stuff like that where like I wanted to do that for me, but if that's not being acknowledged, and if the only way I'm getting acknowledgement is doing this list of things that you're going to acknowledge, whether they be good or bad, like I guess that's what I'm gonna do for the rest of my life. And it sucks because it's like every yeah, just as a sibling, you spend your whole life like, why am I actually doing this? Right? Am I doing this right? Because it shows up in like in your vocational work, and that's what I really like. In the last couple of months, I've been really putting a lot of thoughts into that in particular, and it's just like, wow, like the way I showed up at my earlier jobs when I was like right out of college, I was like, that was 100% coming out of I'm gonna do this to get at like acknowledgement from my manager so that I can do a good job. I wasn't even doing like right, and me, it's not even me doing my job. It's doing all these other things to get the verbal accolades of oh you're doing right, and it's just like man, like it's so ingrained in siblings to really like subconsciously just function like that. Like you have to like the amount of effort I spend going I wanna do this because I want to do it, is like I have a conversation now every day with myself, multiple times a day with my inner child to, like, ask them, like, "Do we wanna do this because we want to or because someone else is saying to do that?" Like, I have to it's all the time.
All the time, everything with, like, like you said, small things, large things, it's that, like, you didn't have the opportunity to do stuff just for the joy of it and get, like, unconditional love in light of that. It all became, like, how you had to get your parents' attention either which way, just like you said, whether it be good things, whether it be bad things. And that carries through. We don't just turn 18 and then suddenly say, well, I'm gonna do things for the joy of it just because I am. I mean, it's the impact of that type of trauma. It really is. You lose yourself and it's such a long but worthwhile road to be able to say, I'm gonna do this for me, the courage to do something just for yourself to do something, even if it means someone else disagrees with you. That was huge for me. Being able to be disagreed with, that's terrifying. It took me so long to be able to say, like, I don't want to go to McDonald's. I actually want Taco Bell. like something small like that, and it's everything, to be able to build on yourself. I think that's a lot of the work that I had in therapy too, is being able to trust in my own experiences, because I got really good at invalidating myself after I was externally invalidated for so long. It just becomes commonplace. You get used to thinking, I can't trust my own intuition. I can't trust my feelings.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's crazy because it's like just because you felt it so intensely for 2 years, but it's interesting because it's like I don't know if it would be different if it had happened for you at a different age, but it happens to be right in the prime of, like, you have already questioned yourself irregardless of her having seizures, and that's what's, like, not fascinating, but it's intriguing because it's just, like, it could have happened earlier or later, but it just that's when it happened, and it's like that. It's just your life is forever just different from then on.
Yeah, from that one night in October and all the following after that, it is, and I think it was, like, the perfect timing to deeply impact me, like, right as I'm like, right just around puberty, just around when you're, like, really starting to explore yourself, trying to figure out who you are, and you have this altering event, and then even after that, even after her brain surgery, I remember it was so hard to reconcile, because all of the sudden she wasn't physically sick anymore. But there was still our family had still been traumatized. She had been traumatized, and so she struggled after that mentally. Totally understand health anxiety, PTSD, and so it didn't. It there were no more seizures, but there was still illness and there was still dysfunction. And I think at that point, because we were out of the woodworks, as in she wasn't going to die anymore. My parents, they kind of it caught up with them, because they at least had to keep it together to get Avery the treatment she needed, because it was, I mean, dealing with insurance, the cost of it was a financial strain, all of that stuff. When that finally was, like, quote unquote fixed, it almost, like, unraveled us even further. So my parents drank even more. We were more distant from each other. But we also had this air of, like, pretending that everything was now okay. It was just bizarre. It's hard to even put words into what the experience was like. And it was like that really. I left for college and I never went back home. I moved out at 18. I lived in dorms and then got, like, summer housing, and I couldn't go back to the house the way it was. Luckily now, my family's a little bit different now. I think especially after my dad stopped drinking, that really helped. Um, but it was the wave of these events that even when there was the surgery, it didn't end for us in the way that I wished it would have. We never um, came back together after that.
And that's so interesting because I'm thinking about it from the perspective of, like, if we had met right after, and not as siblings, but just as, like, if I had met you and you go and you say to me, "Oh, like, my sister just had surgery, blah blah blah," right? And then it's interesting, right? Because I feel like from, like, if I didn't know you and all the things, I would be like, "Wow, that must have been terrible. How's everything now?" And it's very much like you don't tell people what it's like after. Regardless of if they right, they would have to really know your family well enough for you to admit anything. Right? And I think that's just a normal human thing, but that's so interesting because it's like I don't want to say worse, but it's like equivalent in the sense of, like, you could never tell anyone because no one would not only would no one understand, but, like, then it also means that you would have to admit that your family was not just back to normal, which I think it's a different problem than, like, what I have, it's a but that's hard in its own right because it's like you were normal, but then you weren't, and now it's like, what do you tell people? Because you can't lie, because no matter what you say, it's almost like it's lying. No matter even if you're telling the truth, right? Because the people are like, "Oh, blah blah blah," right? Like it's so easy to dismiss anything you say, whether it's true or not. Like,
Yes. Yes, so easily dismissed, and you're so right. It's like I can't say all's good. I can't say I'm struggling, and that I don't think I ever would have anyway. Like I did not talk about this because of that. Yeah, and it's tough. It really is. You just learn to swallow it whole, and that swallowing all of that turned into, like, depression for me that I struggled with for years into college, and being in college and changing that routine for me was when a lot of this stuff really started to to come out with, like, my struggles and having a hard time just with day-to-day life and not really understanding, not being able to put words to it, but also knowing that what I experienced wasn't healthy, wasn't great, but it is, I mean, it's so hard to verbalize, and I think siblings understand, like, we have that kind of connecting understanding where you're like, "Yeah, yeah, I get it," like, that feeling of just, "This is not right," and then having your experiences dismissed or invalidated. I hear a lot from my clients, this, of course, wasn't my experience, but they'd say, if they had a sibling with autism or Down syndrome, they'd say, I heard all the time that I needed to be, like, grateful for what she taught me and what I can learn from her, and I like, "Screw that, no, no." It ruined it my childhood was impacted negatively for years.
I remember saying those things, and then, like, later on, I'm like, "No, I'm not saying that because I don't, right? Like, if you genuinely feel that, then I'll say it if I happen to have a like, it comes that way, but I'm like, "No, like, I can't use, like, I can't use, well, use air quotes, godly phrases to justify actions that then, are invalidating my experiences as their sibling, right? Like, and that's super hard because along the lines of what you were saying earlier about not being able to put words to it and like verbalize what those feelings are. So the for me, like, it's it's one of those things where, like, we can't verbalize it because you don't know it's a problem until much later, like, it's way past too late by the time that you could have said something that in real time to be done, right? Obviously, like, going to therapy is very helpful, right? Talking to anyone for that matter is very helpful, and I still encourage people to do that, but it's that being said, as a 12-year-old or 8-year-old, 15, whatever, like, if you're young enough and you can say to your parents, like, "Hey, you're not spending time with me," that's a very different outcome potentially than, "Oh, I'm, like, 30," and now saying that, and that's like, well, you can't make up for that, right? And if I told my parents that, the goal of that conversation is for you not to fix it, right? But the goal is for you to acknowledge it, but that's hard. No sibling is ever gonna say that to their parent, right? Like, I haven't said, right, like, no one is, right? Because that's not what you do, right? And that's and it's not for them to fix either, right? We have to there's a reason why we don't tell them because it's not about them and that point, right? It's about us saying, like, "I feel this way. I felt this way due to these things, and, like, now we're working through it so that I can heal that part and move on and not feel and function out of the neglect and the hurt and the, like, abuse or whatever, whatever version of childhood that you had." But it's just it's crazy how, like, I didn't know anything was wrong, yeah, until after I moved out, right? So for the large not larger, for the very early part of me being out of college and working, like, I was still at home. So I knew it wasn't as peaceful as it was when I was younger, but, like, I I couldn't, like, I can't change it, right? Because it's like, because my sister is still there and her stuff is still the same and she has her own issues that she has to do, right? But it's like, yeah, there's yeah, it's like there isn't a problem that you realize until you're away from the problem. Right, and that's so hard as, like, and that's why I think this is it's an interesting conversation to have with all of us who are kind of in this, like, late 20s to, like, 40s conversation, right? Because this is the bulk of people who and siblings who we're all old enough to have been working for a little bit, had had gone to therapy on some level, whatever level that is, right? And it's kind of like we're all saying this needs to change in the next generation of siblings who are right now like 5, 6, 7, 8, 12, whatever, right? And there's a good amount of people who I've met who are behavioral therapists that are sibs, right? And they're all about early intervention, right? That's a big thing for them is like being involved super early, like get like acknowledging your neurotypical kids like early, like changing the way that those conversations happen. Because obviously, like what happened to all of us, we were like, well, what? But no one knew, right? And then it couldn't have really been different for us because the tools just weren't there. Like they didn't exist. Like, the internet wasn't there to what it is now, like, it's very different, right? The level of support groups for everyone is so good now because you can be in groups on the internet, not have to leave your house, like, you couldn't do that before, right? You had to leave your house, and that was hard to babysit and stuff, but it's like but it's so interesting how because I feel like Sibs now have like, now we're all adults where we can go, "This is a problem. How do we, like" yeah, right, and Kate's a great example of that, right? Because she wrote her book, right? Because she's, like, the generation before us, right? So and there's another person, his name is Alan, and so he by the time this releases, his episode will be out, but, like, he also wrote a book about his brother, right? And it's interesting, right? Because it's like their experiences were, like, 180 different. Like, it's not right, their siblings got sent away, like, it's a whole different world that they were living, but, like, thematically, right, I can talk to them and we can still talk for hours because at the end of the day, like, they're still siblings and it doesn't matter how old we are because all the pain points are the same. Like, they're the nuances are different, but, like, it's so fascinating how, like, they went through this part of their life already, right? They wrote books, we can read those now, right? And they're still in the space of education, and I think that's the thing that, like, really intrigues me is like, wow, like, it's really just, like, a never-ending thing, which not to say that, like, I didn't know that, but I think it is interesting that, like, there are so many siblings out there that, like, the work would never end, like, which I don't mean to say that in a bad way, but it's a lot. It's a lot, right?
It's wild, and you're so right, like, you can talk to people with such different experiences, right? Like, you and I, we're talking about me going through 2-year stint and then, like, the emotional ripples of it, it was very quiet, very insidious versus your experience, which was years and years and years and years, really all you ever knew, and still have these commonalities. I think, again, it just speaks to, like, this is a problem that's so worthy of being highlighted and being addressed to help the kids like you said that are 5, 6, 7 going through it right now so that they don't have to wait until their mid late 20s, 30s, 40s to heal, right? Like this can be caught earlier and it's so I don't want to say it's easy or simple because that would be an oversimplification, but I think at the core what siblings need is like affection, attention, non-judgmental, unconditional love and acceptance from their parents, and also being able to have your parents or your family name some of the things that are going on and acknowledge it. Like, I know that I have been with your sibling more than I have with you. And I am so sorry I let you down, and I love you so much. What I wouldn't give to hear those words from my parents when I was a teenager. I would have given anything to hear. I don't think I don't think I can ever have that from my parents. That's been part of my journey too, is grieving what I lost.
My husband used to joke for a long time when we were dating, like, oh, like, because I didn't cry very often, like, or at movies or at anything as a general statement, right? Which I now, and then you'll see why, but like, so I was like, oh, okay, like, I don't know, like, and then we got married, cried out of anger, because those are the angry tears that are like a frustration where like I can't identify, like, I can't verbalize what I feel, but I can tell you it makes me feel terrible, which is why I'm crying, right? And then now it's I cry, like, all the time, right? It's all like this because it's really it's really what you were talking about earlier, right? It's all this suppression of like, I can't feel anything else except whatever this neutrality. You can feel neutral or happy. That's it. Like, I really felt limited to two emotions. Like, you can feel nothing, which is neutral, or you can feel happy because like you are so fortunate that like you don't have a disability. You're so fortunate that like she's not having a meltdown, or you're so blessed to like have these people. It's like, well, no, that's not like, and right, and that's where it's really hard to have that conversation of like, well, you're never gonna acknowledge what I feel because clearly you've already built a fence and a box around what you think is happening, and you're not gonna understand even if I tore down that fence anyway. So like, why am I gonna waste my time if you're already perceiving me this way? No.
Why
Right.
bother?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's
Um,
what's hard, right? So we're talking like years of me just suppressing like sadness, frustration, whatever, right? And then well, and my husband's a good sport, but, like, it's been hard for him too, like, I can't lie and say that, he's having a like, what's the word? Like, yeah, he's not having a good time riding this ride either, right? Like, it's it's almost maybe just as hard for him because he doesn't understand it, right? So, well, thank goodness my therapy but yeah, in therapy, because I have words of all, I can now describe to him, "This is how I felt as a child," right? And it gives him context to then at least imagine what my life is like. Even if he's not there, at least, like, my communication skills have increased enough, and I have the words now to say, "Here's an example of what happened." And then we'll look at, like, how he grew up, and then we'll look at the differences. So it's a little more objective, but because they're factual, he's like, "Oh, okay, like, I see how that's a problem." Right?
yeah.
But, you don't have those tools when you're 12.
No,
You
you
can't,
don't.
like,
You
you just
can't.
go, I eat dinner at 5:45 every night, I go to sleep at 9, like, what's the problem?" Right?
Yes,
That's just yeah.
exactly. You don't have the ability. We don't have that reasoning our frontal lobe isn't fully baked in by that point, and so you it's so hard, and we start just mirroring what we expect our parents want or don't want in us, like you said, to get that attention one way or another, and, like, with your husband, being able to I think it's so much easier to have compassion and patience when we can have understanding. So it's so important for us to be able to verbalize and to communicate, not just I feel happy, I feel neutral, I feel bad, right? Because those it's so much deeper than that. That's like surface level emotions. It's not just anger that I feel, it's vulnerability, it's heartbreak, it's injustice, right? And it's when I can communicate that like with my husband and say like if I get even the tiniest hint, it used to be when I'd get a tiny hint of invalidation that would spiral me like and I couldn't quite understand. Oh my gosh, I'd cook him dinner and if he's like, oh it's good but I think I need like can you pass me the salt, it was like,
No,
oh I
yep,
screwed up dinner.
yeah.
Oh I ruined it.
Yep,
Right? Like
yep.
you hate me, you hate my cooking. And I I thought I was just bad. I was like I'm just a selfish bad person and it's not. There's so many complexities and starting to understand that and unravel it, it gives me the tools, it gives him the tools, and then it also when I fully accepted myself and my experience, that's when I was able to crawl out of some of the automatic reactions I'd have. And I think that's a lot of the work that I do with my clients and in my therapy practice is so heavily focused on having self-compassion because it's so easy to think, at least it was for me. Oh, if I had just communicated my emotions when I was 12, maybe I wouldn't be in this mess. No, right? Like that's not compassion. No. And being able to actually feel that I was a child for the vast majority of that experience. And even if I wasn't, my reactions, my understanding, my um attunement or lack thereof was so understandable and it is so okay for me to have been angry, for me to have been performing this role of the good child for and you know I wasn't always I say that I took on that performance of the good kid, not always. Sometimes I was really mad, I was really combative with my father at times because I was so angry, so I played the good child role, but there were times where I was just I couldn't stand them. Like, I was so mad at my parents. I hated them, but then I also, like, loved and craved their attention and affection and acceptance, and that's so hard too.
Yeah, I mean, like, not your parents were not abusive, but it's very the cycles of like abuse and like the trauma triangle, like right, they're all like in parallel to each other where it's like I do this thing for the attention, but it's like, but I'm resentful because you're making me do it, right? And that's a real cycle of well, I mean, it happens in other things in codependency. There's a couple other places it shows up, right? But it's so like yeah, learning that was so helpful because seeing like that I could see my own patterns, but I think what was really helpful was like being able to see that in other parts of my family, because it then made me realize like not only did I do this out of like I needed to survive as in my own house and then school and whatever, but it also as I look at my family, parts of my family now, not everyone has it, but I see the triangle happening in real time and I'm like, "Oh, this is like mirroring behavior." Right? Cuz I was not exposed to anything that was not this triangle. So all I saw in parts of my family when we had like dinners or whatever was this idea like, you should do this. Okay, let me help you. I'm mad at you because why did you make me do it? Right. And I would see this triangle play in multiple versions of my family, and I was like, so I think, yeah, and then there was one day recently, right? Because that's obviously I can look back now and see it as an adult, not as a child. But I sit there as an adult, I'm like, "Oh, like, I had no healthier way to react to this situation because all I was shown was this triangle." Right? Like, I was like, "Well, of course I'm gonna mimic that because I literally didn't know there was an option that was not that triangle to respond to any situation, right? Whether that's with my sister or not, right? Or at work or whatever, and it's been so fascinating to, like, heal enough where I can see it and go like, "Oh, wow, like, it's so hard to get out of it until you either have to be away from those people or you have to be so, like, aware that you're, like, intentionally stopping the cycle from happening, which is hard for any person, right? Even if you're in a regular family of, like, normal people, like, that's still difficult to do that.
It is to break that cycle, to not only, like, to see it, to acknowledge it, and then in the moment, witness it happen, and to break yourself out of it. It is, I mean, it's so, this is like years and years of stuff that you learn how to do by experiencing it, by witnessing it. You're right, that's all you knew. How could you have known anything different? So, of course, as an adult, like, that's what you're left with, and it is so sad that we're then left with the pieces of having to unlearn to break that cycle, but it's all that we have. Like, that's all that we can do, you know? It's not fair, and, like, it's okay to be like, "It is not fair that this was my experience."
Yeah, and I think a really interesting thing to, like I think even for myself to come to terms with in my own journey, right? It's like I if I listed everything that I wish didn't happen, right? And that doesn't even necessarily include my sister, right? There's a bunch of other things I wish like didn't happen, right? And I'm going like, wow, like I like why did I get this life, right? Why am I dealt this hand, right? And it's this thing where like I I don't want it. Fortunately, like we've shifted gears in my adult life where like I like these things. So I'm like, okay, I can at least acknowledge like for what that's worth, it got me there, but not in the way we were talking about earlier where people are like, "Oh, you have something to learn." Like, no, like we're not talking about it that way, right? I want to tell people that it's not the oh, like, you know, you'll learn something or there's a reason for your suffering. Right? We're not talking about that, right? We're talking about like I had to survive. I have these set of skills due to the fact that I had to deal with meltdowns and like immature people and like people who didn't understand and like neglect and like abuse whatever. And we're talking about how that has now put me in a position for me to acquire skills to then change the rest of my life, right? And that's the trajectory we're talking about. Like, and as siblings, like that is probably the most powerful thing we can do is like stopping all these cycles from when we grew up and telling ourselves we can change that. We are doing something about it and like implement that type of change into younger siblings. Like that's all we can do. Cause like, yeah, you can't change your parents. No, should you. That's not your role as their child. And that's the hard part about being a sibling too, right? Is like you become the adult in the situation, which like yours is a little bit different, but it still was, right? Because you still had another younger sister that was normal, right? And that's a whole different dynamic that I didn't have, but I imagine the role is similar where like you switch into an adult brain as a 12-year-old because you don't have choices because your parents are already clearly preoccupied, right? And it's like it's not our jobs to fix our parents, but it is our job to take care of ourselves and like heal the things that were broken either by them or other people or whatever, right? And yeah, because there are outside factors that are still hurtful, right? And it's but all we can do is like put in the work for like yourself, and that which is like the hardest thing to do, right? Because it's like I feel like for every sib that I've talked to that's gone through therapy, right? The hardest thing is to say like to realize that like, oh, my feelings are real, they're not invalidated, and I matter, right? Those are like for every sib that I've talked to, because the fact that's like, wait, I can feel angry. Like, oh, how do I feel in this situation, right? And even with when whether you're friends, right? It's the oh, like I don't want to do that, but we won't say that, right? Even with your closest friends, you won't say I don't want to do it because you're so just in the muscle memory, and it's yeah, like the best thing we can do, like for everyone, is like just work on ourselves and break those cycles that we grew up with. Because what the minute that you're aware enough to realize it's an issue, that's an indication that you're on the trajectory to then change, right? Obviously, for people who like haven't gotten to that point, like don't don't push yourself to do it if like you're not ready to acknowledge those things, or you haven't even become self-aware enough to realize it's a problem, right? That's a different phase, but it's for anyone that, yeah, yeah, I was like, for anyone that's self-aware enough to realize, like, oh, like this is funky, like what you were saying, right? You know something is wrong, but you don't know what it is. Like that's, yeah, go look into it because it's most likely like it's your time to spend the money and the time on your own health and your own
Yes.
sanity and not
It's so worth it.
prioritizing other people. Yeah.
Mhm. Truly, and that's a pivotal moment, that healing for yourself, not trying to be a good enough child that maybe your parents will give you the affection that you like, that's not gonna be the answer. It's more, like you said, doing it for you and your own experiences so you can be at home within yourself. And there's it's so important to highlight that choice. I don't even wanna say that journey for us without invalidating where other people on a different path might be. Just like you said, we're not saying, "Oh, it can get better," as a way to negate your experience, but rather to say, like, I went through this and I don't wanna say coming out on the other end. I don't know if there is another end for me, but I there's something more. There's something more, and I feel more at home within myself to the point where I'm able to do this work with other people. The me of 6 years ago, I never would have been able to sit in the therapist chair and help someone else. I would have been
No,
too
we
aggravated, too
wouldn't be
upset.
talking 6 years ago, we wouldn't even have
No.
met. Like, it wouldn't have happened.
I would have never admitted to these feelings. I would never talk about it. Like, what would have happened? So to see that, to see like this podcast, the fact that this exists, the fact that I am sitting on the therapist side of the chair this time, that like all of these things are indicative of that empowerment and that choice, especially when we grew up with so few choices. There's just something there that, and like with me, there's stuff like you said, there's stuff related to the siblings. There's, a special subset of people who grew up like with alcoholic parents, which was my experience, and how those two things intersect and how they're different. But how so many of those things for anyone listening, if you're curious, there's what's called the laundry list from it's an organization called Adult Children of Alcoholic Parents or something to that effect. And they have a laundry list, which is kind of a list of traits that we often see in adults who grew up with alcoholic parents. And so many of the things are so similar to growing up with siblings: perfectionism or extreme dysfunction, struggling with knowing your own feelings, your own emotions, looking back on your childhood. And just, I remember like being afraid. This was the one time where I went to seek my mom's comfort from being afraid that my sister was going to die. And I went out again, this was at night. I went out to the living room and she had been drinking. She was drunk. And at that point, again, I was 12. I didn't have the language to really understand why that made me so uncomfortable and so upset. But it was something I had to do, like EMDR, a type of trauma therapy for later on in my adult life, like seeking out a parent. And when they're inebriated or distracted or like any of those things, you don't get that feeling of safety that's so important as a child. When you're a kid, your parents are life or death. Like you rely so much on them, and if they're not able to meet your needs, that can just wreak havoc on you. So anyhow, anyone who's interested, check out that laundry list. It was helpful for me to see those things and also see how they coincided with being a sibling.
Yeah. There's so many, yeah, like that, like the feelings wheel is super helpful to like to start to identify, like other than like, neutral, happy or sad. Like I think like I didn't know I felt those things until I saw them, cuz and the feelings wheel is super helpful cuz it's like it's colored. So it's like, oh, like you can, if you, even if you don't know the words, you can like look at the colors and like, it's like red or blue or yeah, right. There's other like ways to interpret your feelings, and that I thought was super helpful, just to like, as I started like using like tools from that to be able to like in a real sentence, I was like, oh, like, and then you can just start to identify like, oh, what made you specifically feel unjustified, instead of just I feel mad. Like, well, why? Like, I don't know, right? But when you start to be more specific, it kind of like makes you think about like, oh, like, is it like what this person said? Was it the time of day? Was it something, right? You kind of think about like, why are you actually upset? And I think that was the that's one of the other things too, like emotionally, like with siblings who like can't communicate, right? With my sister, like she can't even verbalize happy, sad, or whatever, right? She's just either gonna melt down or she's gonna laugh or she's gonna sit there, right? And so it's like, well, if she doesn't have the words to explain how she feels, why would I have the feeling, like, right? Because my parents aren't teaching us those things. They don't know. We're all guessing how she feels. So then we all then just are like, oh, you're doing the empathetic thing, but in a not healthy way, where you're like feeling her feelings, but to try to identify them, but you're not actually doing that. You're just feeling because you're like, I don't know what to do. So you're like panicking while trying to regulate and all these other things, right? And that was a helpful tool. Like being able to regulate, like, changed my life. I will say, like, that was when I first learned how to regulate, when I was feeling all these things. I was like, oh, and then my therapist is explaining, like, yeah, like in a, regular household, like as a parent, you teach your kids to regulate. But I learned recently from one of my friends who's also a therapist, was explaining to me, like, well, but the key is that, like, as a parent, you have to have the tools to be able to teach your children how to regulate. And I was like, oh, and I was like, oh, that's a key, right? Because yeah, so we were kind of having this other conversation about that, but it was kind of, it made me think about that, like after I was able to like acquire those skills, like from my therapist, to do that. I was like, oh, okay, like this is something where, like, in a normal household, right? Because, and this is something me and my husband would talk about, right? Because I would ask him, like, so what would happen, like, if you got upset or whatever? Then he's like, oh yeah, my parents would have me do these things. And I remember I was like, oh yeah, that's not at all like for me what happened. Right? It was just like, get over it, or go help her, or like we'll move up. Right? It's very much more dismissive, right? And not to their fault. It's just when they're in survival mode, and you have a child that's like upset, who isn't neurotypical, that's, like, I'm not giving them a pass, but I understand, like, that's pretty hard to, like, then if you have a second child that is dysregulated, how do you deal with that if you don't have the skill set to be able to deal with it? Like, that's not fun for anyone, even, like, in your household, right, where you and your youngest sister, if you were both I'm sure that was still hard anyway, right, for your parents who, like, yeah, you're just normal kids, it's not like anything else is happening, right? It's hard, but it's just not it's kinda one of the way I think about it for me, it's like it's compounding on the things that are not helping me, right? Because it's one thing to say, "Oh, like, hey, you don't know how to regulate, but hey, you get a lot of attention." Or the inverse, you don't get a lot of attention, but you know how to regulate, right? But to say, not only do you not know how to regulate, you don't get the right, it's just this a different laundry list of things that, like, the longer that list is, the more that I can't help me, right? And that as a child, like, arguably could be your parents' fault, and depending on where on your journey, go ahead and blame them. That's fine. That is your prerogative, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But at the end of the day, like, yeah, at the end of the day, like, all you can do is, like, grieve that that happened, be frustrated if you are, and then just go learn the tools, because it's like, which it sounds, part of me is like, "Man, that seems unjustified that there can't be consequences," but it's like, well, like, would I and I think my therapist asked me this one time, she's like, "Well, would you feel better if that changed?" And I was like, "No." Right? And I wouldn't. I think in real time I would, but, like, as an adult, and I'm like, if that had played out different, would I feel better about it? Like, no. Like, because me being justifiably mad at my parents does not fill the void that I did not have filled, right? Nothing will, other than what I can do for myself, right? Like, and that, and I think that was something very hard to come to terms with, because it's like, wait a minute, you're telling me, like, I suffered this much due to these actions of these other people, and all of it's just gonna almost be for naught, because, right? And that, I think, like, that was, like, the hardest pill to swallow, or one of the hardest pills to swallow was that, and I was like, that is unfair. That is my life." And it's all, yeah, it's like, yeah, like, I think I explained it to someone as, how did I say it? "Oh, I am reaping the consequences of everybody's actions, and my life is suffering for it." And I think that's unfair, like, no matter like,
It
I think that
is.
is unfair.
It's
Yeah.
horrible, it is, and
Yeah.
you're like, the only thing that could have fixed that is impossible. We would need to be able to turn back the wheels of time and have your and that's it's not ever going to happen. It's so important to make space for grieving that, like, grieving the fact that there's nothing you can do to undo what your childhood was, right? Like, we can only, um, make the walls of our life, like, bigger, so that we still have this pain and grief. That's it. Yeah, yeah, changing from the present.
Yeah, you just build stronger walls and higher walls, and just make them bigger, and lead the people that are hurting you, like, you just make sure they don't get to come back in, and that's like, yeah, that's all we can do, which is, it sounds a little dark, but it's true, right? Because once those walls are up, and they're, like, a much better stronghold, like, the life is so much better on the inside of that wall. Because people aren't, like, barricading through the fence, and they're not like, "Hey, I'm gonna just throw chickens into your yard," right? You're really like, "This is my property.
I get to choose.
Yeah, exactly. You get."
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
that's one of the more powerful things in terms of, like, all the choices that we did not have as children, right? Like, growing up with siblings and of various needs and whatever, like, as an adult, like, you do have the choice, like, how you wanna show up in your family and with your friend, right? There are some nuances, obviously, with caregiving that are a little bit more, like, that's a whole different conversation that we're not gonna have today, right? But for anyone that's in a space where you're just trying to navigate your, like, early adulthood away from your sibling and your parents, like, it's so important that you get to choose your friends and how your hobbies, how you want to show up, the frequency of what you want to show up, and like just doing that. Cause really, like, in later on, like, that might not be as much of a choice as it is now when everyone's kind of on the healthier, younger side of the equation, right? Because once we get older, like, that's going to change, and that's a very different ballpark of stuff.
It's so important. I think it's devastating to accept that you can't change the childhood, but once you do that, once there is acceptance for the grief that you'll have and the anger and the injustice of it all, I think that also gives you permission to then choose yourself after that. Once you accept, I can't undo that. There's no way I could possibly show up to, you know, make these things no longer happen to me. You can put a different foot forward. Yeah, and that's what all of this is about. You said it so well, Charlene.
Yeah, thank you. It's a lot of therapy I've been going to. In my inner circle, one of my very good friends is a therapist. So it's helpful just like, yeah, I love talking about it from the standpoint of like obviously I'm not a therapist, but I the amount of like healing that I've been able to do and overcome and be able to talk to other people who've also put in that type of work has been like, I think in my personal opinion, like those conversations are like the most rewarding because it's
Yeah.
really being able to talk to people who understand, who like, and it's crazy, right? Because like being a sibling is already like niche. Then it's like, oh, I'm a sibling who's like XYZ with these other nuances. That's also niche, right? Then you go like, oh, now I'm seeing a therapist versus the siblings who just aren't in circumstances to be able to do that for a mixed variety, right? And I've noticed that I was talking to a different therapist about this who's also a sib. And so we were talking about like talking to people who are in therapy. I think in general that they don't have to be a sib for that versus people who are not, who are like still trying to work out stuff. Like it's just very different. So I've noticed that like, yeah, any sib I've talked to that is in therapy, like the conversations we have, they're just there's just a lot more to them that are like we can get very into specifics without like giving a whole bunch away, right? Because it's just a lot harder to talk to anyone that's like has an issue. They're like, okay, you haven't worked through that, but like it's this thing where it's like it it gives me like it's so hard because it's like when you're doing your own stuff, you're like, it's so much work, I'm so tired. But then when you talk to someone else who's doing the same amount of work who's also just as tired, you're like, okay, like there is a better yeah.
Yeah, like, they get it, they get it, that's the power of peer support, like you said, there's therapy is so impactful, and then when you have on top of it, resources like this or like SibNet or all the various groups of people who get it, it gives you I don't almost permission to be like, "Oh, wow, yeah, it's not just my therapist validating me because that's her job," which is not true, by the way.
Right.
Like, your therapist cares about you, I promise. But to actually see other people, even if they're the same subsets, different subsets, like, it's just there's so much about having that peer support or people who can really get it. Books like Kate's book, right? So important in my own journey. That was a pivotal point for me. Seeing it just it all it all matters. It really does.
That's the exciting thing too, because I don't remember if I told you this before, but the amount of siblings I've met that have written books since the pandemic has been like I think there's been 3 or 4 people on this podcast in addition to Kate who've written books. And those are all like post 2020 published dates. Right? It's one of those like, oh, it's funny because it's all at the same time, but like it makes sense because it's like you were at home and like you had the time, but it yeah, and it's just one of those things, like, I'm excited for, like I told them this, like, probably a year or 2 ago, and I was like, "Oh," I used the word reckoning, which we can use a different word, but I think there is gonna be some type of, like, force of siblings that's coming, that's going to change something. I don't know how it's gonna play out, and I don't know what it's gonna do, but from a lot of people I've met, there's a lot of people that know it needs to change. in some way, right? Like, whether that's, like, opening their own private practice, whether it's, like, being involved in, like, sib shops, which is I think is a great option for people who wanna get, like, directly involved, right? I've met people who, like, lead nonprofits, I've met people who are, like, writing book right, there's so many, like, proactive things that people are doing in their own spare time, right? Some people do it full time, a lot of people don't, right? And it's it's going to change. I don't know how, but I know that something is coming where like siblings are going to get they're going to get a new and or better space than what we previously got. And I think that's going to be really exciting.
Oh, me, I can't wait. I think that there's something about being able to make meaning not as a way to gloss over what we went through, but to say, I went through this, and perhaps by sharing my experience, by using technology, by like me opening my private practice, the focus on this, um, I can make something this world like a little bit better for that 12-year-old who's going through what I went through when I was 12. And it does, it gives me hope. Like I picture myself as that 12-year-old, and I wish I could tell her, like, you know, hold on tight. Like you're gonna, it'll be okay. It won't be okay, but it also will at the same time. Both of those things are true.
Yeah, I was told that so many times as as a child, but in a way that was much more passive to kind of move on. But it's true though, like there's like when I tell like my inner child and stuff like we talk about it all the time, right? Like it's I'll say it's gonna be okay, but like I mean that in the like, well, we're gonna get through today and we're gonna have fun and we're gonna do these activities and like we'll like not like right when she's happy, then we'll like have fun, and if she's sad, then we'll like sit. And I think it's really taking it's about like taking the extra time because like one of the things much earlier when we were talking about when you were talking about when your sister went into surgery and you went to school, right? And it's very much like that's so easy for all of us, right? Like I used to entrench myself in like I would just like I would work more. I would work on Excel spreadsheets because that's like that took hours, right? Like I'm not gonna do something that's gonna oh it's take five like nope, I'm gonna sit there, take my sweet time and like only think about right and it's kind of like this idea where if I make it perfect, I can focus on that and not think about all these terrible things happening. But you don't in real time, you're not thinking that, but, like, when I look back, I'm like, "That's 100% what that was," right? It's disassociating from what's happening because I can't handle it, right? And it's so easy as sibs to disassociate in multiple capacity ways, right? But it's about if you feel something, you should take the extra 30 seconds, go to the restroom, and then go figure it out, right? And you don't need to, like, solve it. You just need to take that extra 30 seconds to say, "I feel blank." Take a deep breath and then go back, right? Like it's really just that 30 seconds is so much more than we got as children and teenagers like that's invaluable to really set a timer if you feel bad about it, right? Like for people who that really are like, "Oh, I can't," like set a timer of 30 seconds and really like just say, "I feel," look at a wheel, think about it, acknowledge even if it's negative or positive, whatever, right? It took me so long to acknowledge I feel angry, but I tell you, once I got on that train, I can't, it kept
Oh,
going.
yeah.
So much
Like I'm
easier.
gonna feel it.
Yeah, it's so much easier
Yes.
after that. And I think it's really like yeah, that 30 seconds for us is almost like an eternity, just because we were told for so many years or months or hours, whatever, right? Like, you can't feel that, right? And not even in that language. I think it'd be so different if parents outright just said, "Hey, I don't want you to feel this. Can you just be happy?" It'd be a different problem, but at least it would you at least I feel like that's a different thing to work through if someone was like verbally saying these things to you versus oh, I just feel guilty because you look like you're busy. And that's a very different, like, emotional thing to work through, and I think, like, it's so hard, and I feel like that's what have been the also the interesting thing, like, we were talking about, right, where you can't communicate that to most people because most people don't understand that concept. Even, like, with your husband and my husband, right, like, that even something like that, like, I'll explain to them, they're like, "Oh, that's strange," and I'm like, okay, at least that at it's close
At
enough
least
for
something.
Yeah, it's at least
Yeah.
something, but, like, unless you're talking to a sib, like, the and that's, like, what's really hard, right? It's like, I think there's been a couple of sibs I've met, maybe, like, 2 or like, a handful that they've almost never met another sib, right? And it's unfortunate, but I don't blame them because it's not something you're gonna talk about, like, in your, casual, "Oh, I've just met someone in high school," like, you're not gonna do that, but I will tell you, like, once that door was open, like, everything changes. The way, like, one of my really good friends, we were, like, friends for years and then found out we were both sibs, and that, like, changed our whole friendship. Like, the way we talk about stuff, how we, like, cut like, it's like, we would have been friends anyway, right? Because we were, but, like, it changes. Like, just yeah. And even if you yeah, and that can happen online, it can happen in person, whatever, like, it almost doesn't matter, but it's like, with what you were saying about, peer support, right? Even if you find, like, one person somewhere that's a real person, not a robot, hopefully, like,
No
right, if
AI
you
here.
find a real person
Yeah.
like that, that's really it's so helpful, right? And they don't need to validate all your problems, and they shouldn't become your therapist, but, like, I will say they will understand a magnitude of things that you cannot explain to normal people, and that is invaluable to be able to say to someone, um, like, "Hey, like, I'm just having a really bad day with my sister." And for them to actually understand what that means,
Mhm.
because it
I
is
get
not the
it. Yeah.
same when you say that about a regular neurotypical kid. It's just not, right? And that's it's yeah, even that yeah, even if you're not gonna go see a therapist or whatever, like, go find at least one sib. And that's all
Yes.
you need. You don't
Some
need a
community.
whole whatever, but, like, it's having that is that's going to fill you more than you could ever dream of from your parents, guardians, family, yourself, whatever. Like, that's yeah, having someone that knows what you're talking about is so
Oh, you're
helpful.
so right. You're so right. It's vital. It's so important that even with just one person, there's a community there and someone who like gets you on that deeper level. And like you said, not in a therapy way, not in a you have to say everything, almost just that unsaid. They understand the unsaid. You don't have to explain every little thing. They know what it means when you say, I'm having a bad day with my sister. They're like, oh
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
I
And
get it.
that's yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you found that, and I hope that for all the siblings too.
Yeah, it's
Someone.
I mean, yeah, just one person. Yeah, so I'm excited for like that and that part is the positive side of the power of the internet is like it enables people to like find each other that otherwise can't leave their house, have social anxiety, whatever. There's a very right. There's more comfortable online, whatever. There's a variety of things, and I think that's yeah. There is a space for all of us. You just have to kind of find your medium. But I think once you find your medium, like go meet other sips. Once you figure out what your medium is, because they're out there. Because like you, they're also trying to find other connection
Yes.
and things. Yeah.
Just trying to figure it out. They are if you look, they are out there, right? Like it's just a matter of finding that place. But there are, especially now, I'm so glad with all the resources we have now. I think that's part of in how like the great reckoning, how that might come forward is actually having like a way to get our voices out instead of our parents speaking for us, which in the past is usually how it went. So yeah, oh, I'm so excited. I'm so glad you're doing this too, Charlene. I
Yeah.
think this
Thank
is
you.
part of that story. And part I think even like maybe in some ways how people start to find that community is starting through something like a podcast where there's not that it can be scary to know you'll need to emotionally connect with someone else. And that vulnerability is something that siblings aren't always great at. And having a podcast where you can listen and hear your story reflected or understood, man, that's a great starting place too.
So cool. Like we could keep going, but
We could.
yeah, I know we could, but we will round this one out with what are your words of encouragement? Because we've obviously talked about a lot of things, but do you have any specific things you would like to share as your encouragement for other siblings?
Uh, reflecting back all that we've talked about in the past little bit, and I'd say on top of that, um, permission to fully experience whatever that means for you. So if it means being angry and disappointed in your parents, man, be angry and disappointed. If it means feeling that, but then also feeling love and compassion for them, man, that's perfectly okay. If that piece isn't there for you, that is so allowed. And then I'd also say like inviting compassion towards yourself, towards all those parts of you that you had to form to survive. So like the dissociative part, the part of you that is a perfectionist, or the part of you that acted out to get attention. There is no shame in any of those things. And to be able to hold yourself with understanding, love, and acceptance, that's one of those pieces that I think is a pivotal point too. So even just practicing that, is so transformational, and just sending like my love to all the sibs out there. It is not an easy journey by any means, and it is so it's easy to get your story invalidated by others. Like we've said, the oh, it's gonna be fine. Oh, be grateful for your experience. You don't have to feel that either. You don't have to be grateful.
Yep, you don't have to accept that from people at all.
Not at all. That's what I've got for the sibs out there, and I'm just um proud of each and every single one of you, and of you too, Charlene. Like
Oh, thank you.
this has just been absolutely wonderful.
And if anyone needs help learning how to hold multiple feelings at the same time, go watch Inside Out. It's a great visual indication of being a good child and what to do with your emotions and how to do that. So go do that.
Please do. It's so funny you bring that up. That is often a therapy homework assignment I give to my client. Go watch Inside Out.
Yeah, go watch Inside. Yeah, even if you don't talk to another sib, go watch it and then just enjoy it, grieve with it, feel the emotions, and have a good time. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Charlene. It has been a delight.
Thanks for listening to the Special Needs Sibling Podcast. I hope you had a good time listening and feel encouraged in your own journey as a sibling to someone with special needs. If you liked this episode, please share it with your friends. And if you want to hear more stories, please subscribe to the show. You can find us wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, the show can't happen without you. All special needs siblings have their own unique stories, challenges, family dynamics, and lots of life to talk about and explore. This podcast is here to let you know that you're not alone and that you matter. If you would like to be on the show or just chat off the record, please contact me. My info is in the show notes. Until next time, this is the Special Needs Sibling Podcast.